Hello and welcome to this session on Evolving DevOps, navigating the career pathways and new roles in 2023 and beyond. My name is Savinder Puri and I'll be taking you through this session. Now, instead of creating the same old PowerPoint deck, I thought since we are creating and talking about career pathways, let's create a mind map for that. Let's get started. Now, before I deep dive into the subject, let's talk about who I am, where I'm coming from, and why I think I'm qualified to talk about this subject. Let's check the fruit on the tree. Alright, so let's start with talking a bit about my work. Now, experience, I have been in the software industry for about 23 years. I have worked in these 23 years in UK, Europe, South Africa, US, India. I have worked in startups, I have worked in large enterprises, and at one point I had a little consultancy of my own as well. So I've kind of been around the block. As in one of my last consulting gigs, the problem statement given to me was take me from check-in of code to going live in production in less than 20 minutes. So I've kind of been around the room. I've seen this DevOps thing evolve over the past 2 decades. So that's my experience. Now, talking about my current role, I'm a DevOps evangelist with a bank in Europe, and I do this role remotely from India. So that's around my work. I'm also an ambassador with DevOps Institute, also with Continuous Delivery Foundation, CDF. Now, if you've not heard of CDF, these are the maintainers of projects like Jenkins, JenkinsX, Tektron, Spinnaker, and a whole lot others. And I'm also a signatory of minimumcd.org. What that means is it's a consortium which specifies the minimal requirements for a continuous delivery setup. It's a very interesting little project. It's a concept. If you've not seen it, I'd highly recommend you to check it out. So that's what I do as the ambassador. I also have a little YouTube channel where I mix DevOps technology and spirituality. And the reason I do that is I believe that as your DevOps implementation goes bigger, as the rollouts go multi-country, multi-team, you need a bit of spirituality infused into all of that for this transformation to be successful. And that's what I talk about in my YouTube channel. I have 2 books. One is How to Build a Career in DevOps, and I'll take some nuggets out of this in this talk as well. And the second book that I've just released is called Spirituality and Success, a guide to using spirituality for success at work and home. Both of these books are available on Amazon. All right, so that's the fruit on the tree. That's who I am. Okay. Now, let's talk about the career pathways, right? So I've kind of divided this talk into 2 sections. One is the DevOps career pathway, the traditional one. This is where the traditional DevOps engineer, senior DevOps engineer, DevOps architect, all of those lie. And this is inspired from Slack's engineering pathway. If you've not seen this, it's a beautiful document created by the makers and the smart engineers at Slack. You should have a check at that. So I've kind of taken that as an inspiration and then created my own career pathway for DevOps. That's where we'll start with, and then we'll talk about the new roles, and then we'll talk about what's next. So let's start from here, the traditional DevOps pathway. So we'll start with the DevOps engineer. Okay. So I've divided this into 3 sections. We start with responsibility, collaboration, and execution. So let's look at what are the responsibilities of a DevOps engineer. It's to ensure your continuous integration, continuous delivery pipelines are working. So creation of those pipelines, maintenance of those pipelines, things like that. And to ensure that and support the agile squad with effective use of DevOps tools. So that's what a DevOps engineer does. Okay, now coming to collaboration, who all would they collaborate with? Primarily your agile squad. What all do they do? Create and maintain the DevOps pipeline, debug, build breaks, and DevOps toolset issues. What does that mean? If I am a DevOps engineer and my build breaks, I am responsible for figuring out why the build broke. Was it a code issue? Was it a configuration issue? Was it a setup issue? Was it a pipeline issue? Things like that. I'm also responsible for DevOps toolsets. What does that mean? Everything from your code repository, which can be GitHub, which can be Azure DevOps, right down to your build tool, your static code analysis, your security tools, in the Docker world, your Docker registries, your Docker scanners, all of those tools I am responsible for setting it up and across the SDLC. So that's what execution means, and that's typically what a DevOps engineer would do. Now, obviously, depending on the tech stack, this could be across the technology stack as well. But as DevOps engineers, because I'm focused on my squad, it will be for the technology stack of my squad. Okay, let's move on to the next one. So, a senior DevOps engineer, what am I supposed to do? In terms of responsibility, so my responsibility primarily is to ensure continuous delivery. What does that mean? That means that I, as a senior engineer, am responsible for ensuring that anything and everything required for my product to be released on a continuous basis is in place. What does that mean? Primarily focused on toolset across the SDLC. Now, in terms of collaboration, I would primarily collaborate with agile squads in my project or product. Also, I would work with allied roles like InfoSec. For example, what kind of security scans do you need embedded into the toolset? I would also work with the release manager. What's my release plan? Do I have enough bandwidth on my release pipelines to be able to build, test, and release and do stuff like performance testing and all of that? I would also work with the infrastructure team to make sure I have the requisite infrastructure available to take care of the impending release. So you see, as my role increases, my scope of collaboration also starts increasing. If I talk about execution, I'd be responsible for creation of new DevOps pipelines across tech stacks, because now I'm not just one squad, I work across multiple squads. So I create pipelines across multiple squads. I'm also establishing integrations across SDLC. What does that mean? Connecting my source control to my build system, to my deployment system, to my defect tracking system, to my release system, so that when a product is released and a bug is found, it can be tracked back to the source control all the way across the SDLC. And I'm also responsible for onboarding new projects onto the pipeline. I have a set of pipelines. I know the technology stacks. As new squads are formed to roll out new features, those squads also need to be onboarded into the DevOps pipeline. So I would be responsible for that as well. Now, moving on from a DevOps engineer, let's move on to the next one, which is a DevOps architect. What does an architect do? I architect the DevOps pipeline. What does that mean? I define what the DevOps pipeline should be. What are the essential tenets of a pipeline? I ensure adherence to DevOps principles. What are these principles? Things like you build it, you deploy it, you run it. That's one of the common DevOps principles. What do I mean? I ensure adherence to these principles. That means I talk about these principles to the squads that I'm working with. I help them, I mentor them, and that means adoption of the DevOps culture. So that's part of my responsibility as a DevOps architect. Whom all do I collaborate with? All agile squads in your product or project. All roles across SDLC, we spoke about that. We spoke about InfoSec. I'll also work with the release manager. If you have an environment manager, I would also work with him or her. I would further work with the database team, the support team, basically everybody who's responsible for releasing the product. You build it, you deploy it, you run it, all of that stuff. Now let's go to execution. I would do the technical support to DevOps and allied teams in terms of what technical capability you're looking at, what technical acumen you're looking at from the DevOps team. I would also drive the DevOps culture, and I would assist in the measurement of key metrics. What are the metrics that the DevOps tools are supposed to drive, and how these metrics can be automatically collected by the DevOps tools, as against somebody going in manually and collecting all of that. So that's what an architect does. Now let's look at a DevOps consultant. Now typically in an organization, in a DevOps person's career path, after you've become a DevOps architect, you can go one of two ways. You can become a DevOps consultant, which typically is an external or a customer focused role, or you could become a DevOps principal, which is a more internal focused role. Let me explain what I mean by that. So the responsibility of a DevOps consultant, typically this role exists in service or consulting organizations, right? The responsibility of this role is to understand customer pain points, do a technical solutioning, and you would represent the DevOps part of a customer solution. Because when you go in as a consulting team, as a services organization into another organization, you would probably propose a much bigger transformation solution, and DevOps would be a part of that solution. So you own that solution. You also research on the bleeding edge of DevOps tech as relevant to your organization, because you have to keep upskilling and you have to keep your services and your offerings relevant. That's why you need to learn what's bleeding edge in DevOps. In terms of collaboration, you would obviously collaborate with the customer whose issues you're trying to fix. You would also collaborate with the customer's business, because through DevOps, we are trying to solve a business problem driven by a technology solution. So you need to understand a bit high level of what the customer's business goals are. You would also want to talk to your internal sales teams. So for example, if I work in a services organization, let's say the Wipro, Cogni, the Infosys of the world, I would definitely work with my own sales team to figure out or to educate the sales team on how to sell this offering to the customers. I would of course talk to my DevOps team, because those are the guys who are implementing these solutions. Those are the guys who are creating these new accelerators, the new frameworks, these new solutions. So I need to be able to guide them on what the customers are asking for and whether we have those solutions ready to go to the customers. And I also collaborate with other tech teams. For example, if there's a team which is focused on Oracle, I would go to them and say, hey, how can we do DevOps for Oracle? How can we do DevOps for Salesforce? How can we do DevOps for ERPs? How can we do DevOps for legacy systems? So those are all internal tech teams which are working across technology stacks, and I need to be able to talk to them to figure out what does DevOps mean for this particular technology stack. Okay, now when we talk about execution, I'm responsible for net new and existing new business, which means if I work for a services company, if I work for let's say a Deloitte, and I have this bank as a customer, net new business in the bank would be part of my responsibility, and existing new business in the existing customer EN would be part of my responsibility, and getting new customers from a DevOps perspective would also be my responsibility. Then creating and defending technical solutions, and of course capability building. Because I need to keep my offerings current and bleeding edge, I need to build that capability internally as well. Alright, so that's on the DevOps consultant. Now let's move to DevOps principal, which is a more internal focused role. What does that mean? Let me minimize these so there's no distraction. So typically this role exists in product organizations. Now you could be creating a DevOps product, you could be a bank or a financial service where you are doing DevOps in-house within the organization and the whole bank is a product. Something like that. You understand what I'm saying, right? You understand the squad's pain points, you do technical solution for them. The only difference between a principal and a consultant is principal is inward looking, consultant is more outward looking. So for your own organization squad, you look at the pain points and basically you ask the question, are we doing things right? And of course, you research on the bleeding edge DevOps tech. Collaboration, pretty similar. Internal dev squads, business, sales, because there is a new functionality which the sales is needing. How do I get it done from the dev teams? What capability do I need to build in terms of a platform? Do we need to go to cloud? Do we need to go to only GCP for this data lake? That's why that part, the DevOps team and other tech teams, we've already spoken about this. Okay, and then execution, defining the DevOps direction in terms of the people, process, the tools, then setting up the measurement metrics. What metrics do we measure? How do we measure them? And internal capability building. Okay, that's principle. Now let's talk about DevOps evangelist. What the heck does a DevOps evangelist do? Okay, let's go one by one. Responsibility. So align tech capabilities with business goals. So the business wants to go faster. The business wants to do one release every month, one release every 2 weeks. Currently, we are doing one release a quarter. What do I need to do to get from here to there? What technical capabilities do I need? What infrastructure do I need? What upgrades do I need to do on the tech side? This is what that means. Measure metrics in alignment with business and showcase the value of DevOps. Because business is always of the mindset, I'm going to spend 100K, show me a 5x, show me a 3x output. So how do you measure that in terms of the business value being delivered by this DevOps initiative? Now this value could be in terms of dollars, it could be in terms of time, it could be in terms of reduction of production defects. Any perspective you can come through which is relevant to your organizations. Primary question, are we doing the right things? Are we putting in the right initiatives which align to the business goals? Now you see the difference here. An evangelist is thinking of, are we doing the right things? And the principal is thinking of, are we doing things right? Yeah, so that's the difference here. Sorry, I lost my screen for a minute. Okay, and of course, upskilling, especially of legacy workforce. Now, in any large enterprise, you would have a bunch of people who are very fancily doing the Kubernetes, the serverless of the world. But there is a much larger workforce which is still doing WebSphere administration, JBoss, and that landscape is slowly decreasing as you move towards the new tech stack. But these guys still form what I call the wisdom of production, and they need to be upskilled. So how do you do that? So that's the responsibility. Whom do you collaborate with? Pretty much similar. What do you do? A DevOps evangelist is responsible for defining the DevOps strategy, for setting up the DevOps grammar. What do I mean by that? What is DevOps for my organization? What does it mean? What's a one-line definition of DevOps? What is continuous delivery for my organization? What is continuous integration? What is the definition of the prerequisites before a release for my organization? So that's the DevOps grammar. Once you define that, everybody conforms to this grammar, which gives a common language to be spoken across the enterprise. Defining the metrics to measure, we've spoken about this, and also the upskill metrics. How many people do I have in the organization in the DevOps roles which need to be upskilled? What's the upskill map? How many new certifications, how many new learnings are we doing per quarter? And how do I upskill all of these folks over the next 12 to 18 months? Things like that. So that's the DevOps evangelist. So that's the traditional DevOps pathway. Okay, now let's look at the DevOps career pathways and new roles. Okay, so I'm going to talk about 3 roles, which is the DevRel, the developer relations, the developer advocate, and a community builder. So let's look at them one by one. So what are the responsibilities of a DevRel? The first one, open source development. What does that mean? It helps maintain the organization's open source project and figure out what next open source project the organization should work on. Then to identify practical use cases for development, because you're talking with the customers, you understand their requirements. Maybe they need a new feature, maybe they need this feature to be enhanced. So you take that feedback onto the product head and get this done. Engineering pre-sales, because you're customer facing, you need to create product demos, proof of concepts for showcasing your product's capabilities to the customer. Let's say the customer has a very unique use case. Maybe you need to build a proof of concept for that. Of course, a lot of content writing, content creation, things like articles, how-tos, use cases, case studies, decks, ebooks, social media content, all of that stuff. And then the most important one, speaking at conferences, demos, and putting yourself and your product's name out there. So that's the responsibility. What are the typical skill sets that you need? You need a basic application development experience, because you need to set up your product demos. You need to understand how the product works technically. You will end up setting up the product multiple times on different environments, different use cases. So you need an app development experience. You obviously need a writing experience to be able to explain in very simple words these complex things that your product does. And you should be able to excite an audience definitely about your product by speaking well. So those are some of the skill sets that a DevRel needs. Now from DevRel, let's move to DevA. That's the Dev Advocate. Now what are the responsibilities of the advocate? You engage with online developer communities. You put yourself out there, you put your product out there in multiple communities, and then you engage with them. You figure out if they're liking the product or not, if they have any feedback, those kind of things. You capture feedback from the dev community and feed it back to the product teams. You liaise with developers at events and tell them, hey, why don't you try my product for 2 weeks, give me feedback, let me know what you think. You liaise with your DevRel and get them what they need from your developers. Content creation, documentation, pretty understandable. Typical skill sets, sound understanding of your product's tech because you're talking about it, verbal, written communication, deep understanding of developer communities and forums in your specific niche, and always curious to learn, always running new things, and it will help if you are a mini influencer or a trendsetter in your area as well. So that's what a developer advocate does. Now let's look at community builder. In terms of responsibility, you have to put out the community strategy. What's the community strategy? What are we trying to achieve when we engage with communities? And then develop and maintain community events, meetups, webinars. How do you put the word out there for your product? Manage and build relationship with C-levels, partners, referral partners, B2B influencers who will talk about your product and spread that knowledge. Then sales and marketing. How do you drive demand generation? How do you put your product out there so that it reaches people? And then feedback, we spoke about this. And how do you monitor and analyze the community engagement? In the last quarter, we did 10 events. We spoke to 2,000 people. Here is what they said. Because of this, we have released 2 new features, which has increased our user base by 10%. Things like that. Those are the responsibilities. Now, moving on to the typical skill sets. Here we go. You demonstrate ability to build and manage relationship, analytical skills because you're using data to drive the decisions. Of course, work independently, passion for building and nurturing communities, and excellent communication skills. So that's about the community builder, right? So we spoke about 3 roles: DevRel, Dev Advocate, Community Builder. So that's the pathway for new roles. All right, so what's next? How do you take all of this information and how do you process it? Number 1, you figure out what interests you. Are you interested in core tech roles or are you interested in allied roles? And try a bit of both. And let's see if it makes sense to you. Yeah. Do some open source contributions. Try your writing skills on Hashnode, Medium, etc. Participate in hackathons. So figure out what interests you. That's step 1. And then talk to a bunch of DevOps people. Figure out how these roles are happening in your allied organizations, conferences, talk to people on LinkedIn. Look at my YouTube channel. I've done some interviews with a bunch of DevOpsy folks. So see how that happens and if you like that experience. Very important, learn in public. If you're picking up a new skill, tell them over the next 3 to 4 weeks, I'm going to be learning this new technology. These are the resources I'm looking at. This is how I'm learning, and put out new content every week. That will help you in the content creation part and the communication part as well. All right, so that's that. Final thing, how do you reach me? Very simple. The best way to reach me is through LinkedIn. You can send me a direct message, send me an email, and that's how I am. Hope you found this interesting, and I will be around to answer any questions that you have. Have a good one.